Welcome to another episode of the Federal Newswire Lunch Hour podcast with your host, Andrew Langer.
Well, hey there, everybody. Welcome to another episode of the Lunch Hour with Federal Newswire. I'm your host, Andrew Langer, and if you are listening to us on one of the many fine podcast platforms that are out there, you can check us out on our YouTube channel. We now have a new Twitter account, or X, whatever the young folks are calling it these days, so please follow us there on X. If you're following me at Andrew_Langer, you'll see that I've been tweeting out from the Lunch Hour, but please subscribe, like, leave a comment, but most importantly, let your friends and family members' friends know how much you're enjoying the show. Joining us today, very excited to bring him on. His name is Andrew Hale. He is the J. Van Andel Senior Policy Analyst in Trade Policy at the Heritage Foundation's Thomas A. Rowe Institute for Economic Policy Studies. I think he's got a longer title than I do. In this role, he focuses on U.S. trade policy, regularly publishing commentary and analysis on issues such as tariffs, trade agreements, and the economic impact of trade programs. Hale's work is featured in outlets like the American Conservative and The Hill, where he advocates for policies that promote American competitiveness and economic freedom. What you're going to find out is that at least I suspect, he's not from here originally. In fact, Andrew, tell us a little bit more about where you're from and how you came to be over at Heritage.
Well, I've been at Heritage now for 2 years. Prior to coming to Heritage, I worked for the United Kingdom's Department for International Trade as a trade official. Before that, I worked in the U.S. Congress for the Democrat chairman of the Foreign Affairs Committee.
Wow.
I've worked in aerospace. I've worked at the State Department, and yes, so I've had a varied career on both sides of the Atlantic. American mother, British father, and I have obviously lived in both countries. So I am an American.
Well, we had Fred de Fossard from the Prosperity Institute on. I don't know if you know Fred.
Oh yes, of course.
So Fred was on a little bit ago. So we're really trying to bridge the pond as much as we can here. So let's start with this, getting down into the meat of it. Yeah, actually, we'll come back to the meat of it. Let's start with the veg first. So trade policy, lots of discussions going on about this. I was at a high-level meeting a couple of weeks ago in which I caution folks not to be too obviously, we can be concerned about tariffs, and rightly so, but to understand that tariffs aren't necessarily, the impact of tariffs isn't necessarily in a vacuum. There are so many factors that go into this. One of the things that I pointed out was the issue of the cost of regulations in the United States and how that impacts our competitiveness. Talk about tariffs, but talk about the overall landscape of an economy and how tariffs play one part of that.
Well, tariffs are not the panacea to all of our problems. For example, if you look at the steel and aluminum tariffs, in 1990, we had 57 blast furnaces, and we're now down to 11. In fact, one in Birmingham, Alabama, which I believe was first built in the 1890s, had its last upgrade in the 1950s. The door blew open, and the men working there were injured, and some of them permanently disfigured.
Wow.
So we have some very old infrastructure. It's very difficult to get new permits and zoning, and regulations are very stringent. And even just last year, the Biden-Harris administration introduced new regulations, EPA regulations on the emissions from steel production, and net zero targets do not mix. And I will quote Lady Clifton Brown, who referred to them as nut zero targets. We get about 50% of our refined steel from Canada. Why? It's because in Ontario, they're making their steel with nuclear power, which is green power, so green steel. And in Quebec, they're making their steel and aluminium with hydroelectric power. They're blessed with vast amounts of hydroelectric power.
Sure.
And indeed, they provide, Quebec and Ontario provide the energy, the electricity for New England, New York State, Minnesota, and Michigan. So technically speaking, they could just turn out the lights. So again, we've had an integrated market ever since NAFTA, now under USMCA. So 90% of our potash comes from Saskatchewan for fertilizer. So again, it takes years to build supply chains, and you don't just tell the CEO of a major auto manufacturer, move all your supply chains within 30 days, the United States, or 90 days, or what have you. It doesn't work that way. So we will obviously be paying for more.
Right.
Because the solution to some of these problems is not the tariff. I'll finish with this last example, if I may.
Please.
With regards to agriculture, we again have some very bad EPA regulations. Some of our sheep farmers are losing 40% of their herds to coyotes and foxes.
Wow.
Because our farmers are not permitted to strategically place poison bait around their farms. So there's an RCAF petition that's making its way around the Senate, and periodically I get calls from senatorial offices and congressional offices asking me, should the senator or congressman sign on to this? And my advice has always been, you're not going to solve the problem. Basically, the RCAP petition calls for the tariffing of Australian and New Zealand lamb. Well, in Australia, they're allowed to strategically place poison bait around their farms to ward off predators. And in New Zealand, they're blessed with no predators. So here in the United States, we have had the EPA, these are people who are civil servants, who've been influenced by lobbyists, an animal rights lobby that basically prioritizes coyotes and foxes over sheep. And then, of course, we have in my opinion, a very extreme environmental lobby that believes that sheep and cows are detrimental to the environment because of alleged emissions of methane gas through belching and pulsing gas and what have you. So basically, that's what's coming behind this. These civil servants who create these regulations don't own farms, they don't own businesses, and they've taken advice from lobbyists. So we created this problem right here in Washington, and we could fix it by just getting rid of that stupid regulation. And then civil servants have come on the back of that and at EPA and have basically tried to and said, well, farmers can invest these very expensive poison patch collars and put it around the sheep's necks, and the coyote is just supposed to bite into the poison patch of the collar and die. That doesn't work. They just bite around it and they go for the jugular vein. You're left with a dead carcass and a poison patch and collar, the expensive poison patch and collar that didn't work. So we've had some real non-solutions. We've got some very bad regulations. We've got vast copper here in the United States, but it's too expensive to extract it, refine it, and smelt it. So we get it from Chile, Canada, and elsewhere.
It gets down to something that I've said in the past, and I'm going to use two aphorisms. One is mine, the other is my father's. I used to still say from time to time, that the most well-intentioned policies eventually bump up against very real realities. My dad said to me, Andrew, that's too complicated. To simplify it, there are many roads to utopia. However, all must traverse the surface of the earth. And I think this is a problem we have on all kinds of sides of the aisle, and you've been on both sides of the Atlantic and both sides of the aisle here, where you have policies that folks proffer with the best of intentions. And yet when reality hits, right, I'm reminded of, and I don't know if you dealt with this at all, but the issue of VW, Volkswagen, right? US EPA put out standards regarding diesel engines in cars, and the diesel engines had to pollute less, they had to go more on a gallon of diesel fuel, and they had to not sacrifice power. And you couldn't do all three of those things at once. VW comes out and says, oh, we've solved the problem. Turns out, at least at the time, they hadn't solved the problem, that there was a trick in their software. This is what we're talking about, the issue of the best intended policies eventually have to deal with reality, don't they?
Yes, and also in Washington, we have the best government money can buy.
Yes.
So, for example, if you look at the monopoly that the Fanjul brothers have, and I published a paper. I think it was actually published in The Hill. Actually, I can't remember, but it's on the Heritage website. Basically, we have effectively sugar price controls, and so they're big donors. Those Fanjul brothers to both Democrats and Republicans, and we have this protected industry here. And so when I heard President Trump talking about reciprocal tariffs, I said, aha, are we going to also be reciprocal? Are we going to take down some of our protections? Are we going to open up our sugar market to Brazilian sugar? Well, that's not going to happen. That hasn't. So Brazil was highly tariffed on Liberation Day, but we've not responded in like kind by taking down some of our protections. And there's been some very detrimental effect on Americans because of this monopoly that they own Tate and Lyle. They own Domino Sugar, Florida Crystals. They really are a monopoly. But because, like I said, they are a donor to both the Democrats and Republicans, they've managed to influence policy that has protected their industry. And of course, as an alternative to expensive U.S. sugar, we use high fructose corn syrup. And of course, RFK Jr. has been quite outspoken about how this leads to not just obesity in Americans, it leads to obesity in children. We have some of the most obese children in the world here in the United States, thanks to the fact that we've supplanted sugar, which isn't great for you, but it's not nearly as bad for you as high fructose corn syrup. And that's why we have such horrible diabetic rates. Even when, for example, American fast food goes to a Caribbean island nation and they're not used to having this in their system, the diabetic rates go through the roof. And and I'll finish with this, it'd be financially ruinous for countries that have a national health care service. So, of course, it does affect government spending as well as people become more sick.
Well, isn't that interesting? Because, one of the things we've been seeing is that, other kinds of politics, be damned. A lot of the traditional sort of corporate constituencies are becoming very nervous in the face of what RFK Jr. is proposing, and to some extent the Secretary of Agriculture, Brooke Rollins, regarding sort of nutrition standards. They've been very aggressive on this. Do you think that they can, the two of them, because they hold such sway, can actually create greater influence when it comes to this kind of sugar policy?
I think that they can. And of course, the Heritage Foundation supports the movement to make America healthy again. And I've even just noticed a personal level when I travel back and forth between the United Kingdom, Europe, and the United States. I go to other countries where high fructose corn syrup is not an ingredient. I just feel healthier. I actually have more energy. And when I come to the States, and one thing I always notice is I start gaining weight more, after being here. So again, you do have to watch labels more here in the United States than I do when I'm in countries. And I'll finish with this. If you look at, for example, the hormone-injected meat, and that's something that's going to be a huge issue with regards to getting any free trade agreements between the United Kingdom and the U.S. or the European Union in the U.S. because with regards here in the United States, you can take a syringe and just inject a freshly hatched chick, and within 6 weeks, it's a full-fledged hen producing eggs. That is not natural. And of course, then there's some correlations to be made, as RFK and others have pointed out, about how there have been children who have been developing puberty much faster here in the United States than in other countries. So it does actually have an effect on humans, and particularly children.
It's interesting, just anecdotally, because I took my first trip to the UK in March. Was doing Northern Wales and sort of that portion of England, sort of Liverpool, and I had been on a diet. I'd been dieting for the better part of a year beforehand, and obviously broke the diet while we were over there, but didn't really gain much. I mean, we ate in moderation like everything else, but I was, and by the way, this is something I talked about with Fred. I was surprised at how good the food was, contrary to the popular opinion about food in England and elsewhere. Let's shift gears a little bit here. Actually, are you familiar? And this is the danger. I don't make this a dangerous step very often. You're familiar with the Jones Act at all?
Yes, I'm familiar with the Jones Act, yes.
All right. So, because it's interesting, because I'm someone who understands the national security concerns and the reasons for maintaining the Jones Act for national security concerns. But one of the things I pointed out to one of the Jones Act proponents recently was, we've been talking about the importance of maintaining U.S. shipbuilding capacity. And yet, again, we're not seeing any growth in U.S. shipbuilding, even with the maintenance of the Jones Act. Is that a regulatory issue? And does something need to be done about this before we can even start considering the maintenance of the Jones Act over time? What are your thoughts here?
Yes, well, it's a protectionist piece of legislation that's outlived its usefulness. I mean, it's just no longer practical. And it's not just the Jones Act, it's the Foreign Dredge Act as well. And so, for example, I mean, we just need to have some, I think actually one way around the Jones Act is to simply, have the ships parked, because many of them, the big, huge tankers, can't get into our ports because we're not able to dredge them and make them deep enough for these massive tankers to go in. So what you can actually do to avoid the Jones Act, this is what I've recommended here at the Heritage Foundation, a paper I published a couple of years ago, was the fact that what you can do is you can actually just park your ship, so many nautical miles off the U.S. coastline, and then just airlift those big, huge containers into the port. That's one way to get around it. The Jones Act fleet keeps getting smaller and smaller and smaller. I don't know the exact numbers. The expert on this is Colin Grabo at the Cato Institute. But basically, the Jones Act fleet keeps getting smaller and smaller as ships being taken out of commission, just like our blast furnaces have dwindled down now to 11. Same thing with the ships. And so, again, we do need to, and I'll give you this one example. I'm aware of an energy company in Alaska. They just didn't want to go down the coastline and deal with the Jones Act. So they shipped and sold their energy to Asia.
Right.
Just without. So that's people are trying to avoid it by simply not doing business in the United
to
States.
me, I mean, it sort of gets at this issue, right? If the whole idea behind the Jones Act is that it's supposed to protect American shipbuilding, I mean, obviously the national security concerns are something else, and I think you would need something else to deal with that. But at the very least, the issue of the shipbuilding and the issues of cabotage, and repair. It would be one thing if America still had a vibrant shipbuilding industry, even with the 100-year plus existence of the Jones Act. But we don't. And so we need to sort of ask ourselves the question, maybe there's something else that's going on here. And I think some of this gets into environmental rules and some of it gets into occupational safety and health rules, among other things. And I live in an area where there is still vibrant shipbuilding.
I think it actually most importantly goes down to lobbying again. There's a massive pro-Jones Act lobby, which has lined the coffers of both Democrat and Republican congressmen and senators, and there's very little lobbying on the other side of the anti-Jones Act. They have a massive lobby. It's very lopsided. There isn't the voice of the anti-Jones Act people are not, they don't have the lobbyists behind them and the money that's there. So there's a massive Jones Act lobby with, the merchant mariners are a huge influence on this, and they have quite a voice. And indeed, I've noticed when I've publicly published on this, there's one person in particular I'm thinking of who actually will go out and he's got like some sort of, podcast and has a YouTube channel. And he basically starts to, shall we say, vilify the person who's actually, one of them actually said that I think he said it was ignorant and uneducated. And I thought, that's actually maybe defamatory. I could potentially sue over that.
Oh, interesting.
But,
I mean, listen,
actually,
Michael Cannon at the Cato Institute is famous for sort of publishing, the tweets of what people say about him online in response to something that he's saying regarding healthcare. To me, it's obviously, the issue of lobbying and the influence that goes there. It gets down to something I was talking about yesterday in a seminar, which is that the more the government has the ability to pick winners and losers in the marketplace, the more folks are going to start throwing money around to deal with this. For me, it's just really a matter of focusing on the fundamentals, right? What is the policy goal? Is that policy goal being achieved? At what cost is that policy goal being achieved? And what can we do to reach the same goal or similar goals if those goals are still adequate without quite the same cost? If that makes sense, sort of a fundamental rule of thumb here. You can either respond or tell me you agree or not, but just sort of, that was me sort of pontificating for a second.
I agree.
Yeah.
Yes.
So let's sort of turn our attention to part of the reason why I wanted to have you on, given your background, is we've spent a lot of time talking about COSA and other kinds of laws and legal proposals, statutory proposals that serve to regulate content on the internet and solve the problem of threats to kids. Now, obviously, we want to make sure kids are protected, and there are lots of laws that are on the books. But, we wanted to get your thoughts here, but also talk about the experience of regulating speech and how that has impacted the UK. So let's talk a little bit about this and where you come down on the issues of internet regulation.
Well, I think you're concerned about the Online Safety Act, which has just been introduced in the United Kingdom. And remember, this was a conservative government that came in that drafted this legislation, and it's a Labour government that's carrying it out. This actually started with the Conservatives, and although I don't find them very conservative, but I just wanted to actually, I'm looking right now at the UK government's website, and it says in the UK, online harm refers to behaviors or content online that can cause physical, psychological, or emotional damage to individuals or groups. This can include harmful information posted or sent, as well as behaviors like harassment, intimidation, and the exposure of private information without consent. And the Online Safety Act requires platforms to take action against this sort of content. Now, who decides that? And that's the concern I have. Now, listen, we want to protect children. And Ofcom's so you've got the legislation, but then you have Ofcom, which is it's like the FCC, it's the communications regulator in the United Kingdom. And that's led by Dame Melanie Dawes, the chief executive. And so she's the sort of the Ofcom czar, and basically she said it was a responsibility of the media platforms, the firms, not the parents, to make sure people are safe online.
Wow.
And I actually do think parents have an obligation and a
100%.
responsibility to protect their children online, and you can certainly have there's software and apps to deal with protecting that on family computers and phones and what have you. And Ofcom has been putting together codes of practice since the Online Safety Act came into law, and those were introduced in March. And so the act requires all social media firms to protect children from content such as self-harm material, pornography, and violent content. And I would agree with that. I agree that's fine. But it's how we define that and how there can be overreach by public sector officials, civil
Yeah.
servants. I used to be one of those, and I
Yeah.
know how they can be Big Brother, and that's very, very disconcerting. Also, I think the fact that the penalties for a platform like X, or even a small platform like Rumble or what have you, they could be fined 10% of their global revenue if
Wow.
they're deemed to be in violation of the Online Safety Act. That is absurd. I think
Right.
that is overreach by the state. It's been a huge discussion between the Trump administration and Keir Starmer's administration. Keir Starmer, as a Labour Party, was elected on a platform of actually strengthening the Online Safety Act and addressing online harms, as they're called. And this is harmful, but not illegal content. And I think this is quite worrying, where in the United Kingdom now we have a situation that goes well beyond the Online Safety Act. Even before this,
Yes.
we've had people who've had visits from the police to their home because a tweet or somebody put out offended someone. You've had old age pensioners arrested for Facebook posts. And indeed, one of the people who's I think is quite dangerous, and I'll finish with this, Antonio Romeo
Yeah.
was the permanent secretary at the Department for International Trade when I worked there. She then went on to become the permanent secretary at the Ministry of Justice in charge of the courts and the prisons. And at a time when the prisons were so overcrowded, basically the government under Keir Starmer, who used to be the head of the Crown Prosecution Service,
Wow.
got the Crown Prosecution Service to arrest and quickly process these people for online harms and Facebook posts and social media posts. And because there were so few prison spaces, they let out violent criminals, murderers, rapists, and pedophiles out early to make room for these, these so-called hate crimes. And I think that's really, really disturbing. It's Soviet-style behavior. And there is the wokery of all the countries on planet Earth that are the most woke and have embraced all this bad stuff from American academia, this woke stuff. It is the United Kingdom. No country has taken it and just institutionalized it everywhere to the point where they have an Equalities Act which enshrines this. We don't have that here in the United States.
Right.
And the Equalities Act came about in the dying days of Gordon Brown's Labor government, and the Conservatives actually kept it and maintained it. And indeed, it was Liz Truss who was, of course, who was the Equalities Minister and was one of the most woke, and worked alongside Antonio Romeo at the Department of International Trade, and she signed off on gender-affirming care for children, which involved puberty blockers, breast
Yeah.
reduction, chemical castration for kids. And of course, then after she falls from power, and as woke has become less popular in certain circles, and there's been a bit of a backlash against it, she's now, of course, anti-woke.
Yeah.
So again, we have a lot of duplicitous politicians out there that haven't helped matters.
Well, let's talk about the lessons that can be learned for the U.S. because we are told that it can't happen here. But, one would think that, next to us, one of the great classical liberal societies is Great Britain, you would think that it couldn't happen there, but it can, and it did. And obviously the way that they protect speech in the UK is different than how they do it here. But what's the warning that we ought to take away as we move down this road of trying to take the responsibility away from parents and put them into these platforms or enshrine them into the annals of the state? What's the warning?
So when I went back to between 2012 and 2017, I was living in the United States. I went back to the United Kingdom in 2017, and I didn't recognize the country in so many ways. I certainly didn't recognize the civil service. And during my first week on the job at the Department for International Trade, I asked Antonio Romeo, I said, Permanent Secretary, what's the ultimate goal you have this year for this trade department? She said, Andrew, That's a very good question. This time next year, I want to get the highest ranking from Stonewall as the most inclusive employer for transgender and non-binary people. Stonewall being the LGBTIQ plus lobby group, which is highly
Yes.
political and firmly on the left. And I said, Permanent Secretary, with all due respect, I want to be inclusive, nurturing, and affirming of all people. Indeed, I have a friend of mine who is transitioned, and I respect her and use her female pronouns. But what does this have to do with trade policy?
Right.
What does this have to do with export wins, investment wins, getting free trade agreements? And she shot back and says, it has everything to do with it. Next month, I'm leading an LGBTIQ plus trade mission to New York. And what I learned was, as I was going there, I felt every day walking in there for the years that I worked there, that I was walking to some sort of left-wing student union echo chamber, where as you walk down the corridor, there were like plasma screens, flat television screens on the wall, projecting these messages about, non-binary awareness week, transgender this, International Month Against Biphobia, Islamophobia, and there was this vicious race at the bottom where we were all told to join a woke corporate network. And because I have autism and dyslexia, I joined the Neurodiversity Network. But it was really a grotesque race at the bottom to see who was more disadvantaged, who was more persecuted. And this happened under a conservative government where this was all institutionalized. Even the royal family now has a DEI officer.
Yeah.
I mean, how do you make a hereditary monarchy that? Or they were also putting out sheets, and they were putting out basically all this paperwork saying, don't use these words because they offend the gender nonconforming. Mother, father, parent. So you got to use parent instead of mother and father. You have to say child instead of daughter, son. You can't say sister or brother. And just it would be best to use gender neutral pronouns like they when talking even about just one person. And so I just found that they were even controlling the language. And I was told even though I was hired to work in trade policy, I was told to spend one working day doing a corporate network, basically promoting woke stuff.
Right.
And that this is a huge waste of public money. And what happens is that you can't hire good people because you can only hire people based on a box ticking exercise to see who's more persecuted. And then, of course, you would hire more and more people to do less and less productivity, and then eventually leads to system failure. And I remember coming to the States during COVID and sharing some of these stories with friends of mine who work at the Department of Homeland Security and elsewhere in the U.S. government as civil servants. And they said, we don't have this yet, but it was coming.
Right.
Just in the tail end of the Biden-Harris administration, they started rolling this stuff out. And one of the good things President Trump did when he got elected was simply telling everyone all the DEI and ESG stuff must be deleted and removed and handed over to some central office for under Doge for removal.
It really is, especially when you talk about what was going on in Britain. It really is Orwellian at the end of the day.
Yes.
It was exactly what Orwell was predicting. Down to the idea of reinventing the language so that you can't even formulate the words of dissent. And you said this, right? You go there and you have an almost visceral reaction. You don't know the specifics yet, but you know that something is fundamentally wrong. Now, of course, you've got to link the education, but imagine somebody has that recognition, or worse, doesn't have that recognition, but imagine they have that recognition and they can no longer articulate why it's wrong because the language has changed. That's essentially where we're going, isn't it?
It is. And actually, it was so unnerving. I used to work for a Democrat member of Congress, the late Congressman Tom Lantos. I'm passionate about human rights, and I've been involved with human rights organizations my whole life, and I was very much a sort of liberal internationalist in my outlook. It really actually this was so. It was the groupthink. It was this new religion. You couldn't actually disagree with it in any way, and if you disagreed with it or challenged or questioned it, you were canceled.
Right.
And so, for example, actually, I think I've got it right here on my desk. Just to survive and get grade promotions. This is my transgendered lanyard that I would wear my badge with, my government badge for my security clearance. This is my non-binary awareness lanyard. It was everywhere. It was around your neck.
Sure.
And you were given this stuff to wear, and sometimes they would make you pay £5 for it.
Sure.
It's this politicized lobbying group, Stonewall. Basically, I remember actually going for a grade promotion interview about aerospace, and I was hardly asked anything about aerospace. I was just asked diversity, equity, inclusion questions. Talk about creating diversity, equity, inclusion for all in the trade space, and that sort of stuff. These are the sort of questions they asked me, And I really felt that it was very shallow. These are luxury beliefs by people who are generally, well privileged people. And I think more working class people who have more daily struggles in their life um, don't have time for this.
No.
But it's everywhere. It is
Well,
everywhere.
it's even more damning, right? Not only do they not have time for this, but they want the folks who are doing the policies that are impacting their, not even let's say personal lives, but their professional lives, right? As you point out, what's the goal here, Minister? How is the goal not trade? Because you're working class someone in Manchester, you're working class Mancunian, they want to make sure that they have a job manufacturing something that might be exported or even, done internally. And if these jobs are no longer there because someone is focused on somebody else using the right pronoun at the right time, they're not being served, are they?
They're not, and I think that there's such a huge disconnect between the elites who
Mm,
have been captured and the people, and I think that's why we've had these volatile election results in the UK, where there's been the huge shifts. Of course, the recent local elections where there was a massive rejection of Labour and the Conservatives, and people shifting to a very new party that's barely a couple of years old, the Reform Party under Nigel Farage, and I
yes.
think that's happening because there's this big disconnect. And to give you an example, I mean, the Conservative Party was so captured. David Cameron really was the successor of Tony Blair and New Labour. And he actually, because I worked as a civil servant for Labour ministers in the dying days of Blair and Brown, their governments. And I can say that the Conservatives were further to the left. And you had
Wow.
some MPs like Caroline Noakes, who, quite frankly, on many issues, she'd be identical to AOC here in the United States, and she's a Conservative member of Parliament. I've been told by people who've gone for selection, there's been a screening interview, and one of my friends said that they were asked questions like, to screen them out, to make sure that they weren't a true conservative. Do you support Black Lives Matter organization? If you said no, goodbye. Do you support 24 weeks abortion? If you said no, you couldn't be a Tory MP. If you do you support gender affirming care for children? And this person was asked these questions, and I remember my desk officer who worked for me when I was working in North American trade, said that he actually got for the selection. And I said, "Well, how did you get to the selection?" He was quite young. He was only 24. I said, you're going to be on the list to try to get a seat to run for parliament." He said, "Yeah." And I said, "Well, how did you manage that selection?" He says, "Oh, I just told them I was gay." And
There you go.
they put him through. So he ticked a box, and
Sure.
he ticked the politically correct box. And I have nothing wrong with people being gay and
Of
being in
course not.
public office. I'm simply saying it shouldn't be the reason you are in public office.
I seem to think we had a movie here. We now pronounce you Chuck and Larry, and at some point the piper needs to be paid if you're sort of going down that road.
But we do, and quite frankly, my gender, my sexuality, my color, my socioeconomic background, these are not skill sets.
Right.
These are not, that's not job experience. And these should not be, this should be criteria for giving someone a job. And sadly, in the United Kingdom, that's from HR, from the people I dealt with in human resources, that's the only criteria they're interested in at all.
It really is like the ability to take the United States and look not in through a looking glass backwards, but to look forwards at 5-6 years down the road and see where things are. Listen, I always ask folks this before we sort of conclude. I think it's important for my viewers and listeners to sort of understand, not sort of, but to understand that folks are not single dimensional. I should have warned you about this before. I almost did a podcast called Outside Interest where I talk to policy folks about the things that they do that are not policy or politically related. When you're not doing this work, what are you up to? What are some of your outside interests?
Oh, I'm a huge I love the arts and art. I
Yes.
like to collect art.
Okay.
And so I like art. I'm into horses. And I have a lot of friends here in Washington and elsewhere, and I'm quite social. And of course, working at a think tank, a research institute, I'm obviously most often reading.
Yes.
But obviously, if I go to out to a equine event, an equestrian event, then I'm getting off my chair and doing something physical. But I'm more lately, particularly given that the trade space has been so active since President Trump
Yes.
has been elected. I have to say I've been working most evenings and weekends since he's been elected. So the next 3.5 years are going to be somewhat difficult, shall we say.
Busy for all of us. I get that. Well, listen, Andrew, thank you so very much for joining us today. Our guest has been Andrew Hale. He is the J. Van Andel Senior Policy Analyst in Trade Policy at the Heritage Foundation's Thomas A. Rowe Institute for Economic Policy Studies. Andrew, I'm sure folks can find it at heritage.org. I mean, they just do a...
Yes, I'm Drew Hale, at Drew Hale, DC, DREWHALE. DC is my Twitter handle. And then, of course, you can find me at on the Andrew Hale at the Heritage website.
A sobering conversation with Andrew Hale. Appreciate you joining us today. Listen, as I've said, if you are listening to us on one of the many fine podcast platforms that are out there, come and check us out on our YouTube channel. Now you can follow the Lunch Hour on Twitter or X, or follow me at Andrew_Langer. I am, as I said, Andrew Langer. Enjoy the rest of your lunch.
This has been the Federal Newswire Lunch Hour podcast, hosted by Andrew Langer. Check out the Federal Newswire's family of websites, as well as their social media stream